Hello, welcome. We are covering the War for Independence. We're moving ahead a little bit. So I'm going to move this to share. All right. So that which I consider almost universal context, right, to the War for Independence from 1775 to 1783, gaining our independence from Great Britain. So with this, right, a lot of people go into a couple different camps. One is ideological, and they focus on the role of ideas and beliefs that supposedly make the United States exceptional in motivating our rebellion and leading it and undergirding it. And then you also have material determinism. And material determinism is they look at more, kind of a classic revisionist history, and you're looking at people trying to gain power, resources, autonomy for more kind of base material reasons. So, at any rate, moving into that, regardless of whether you do the material or the ideological route, I think the following is pretty pertinent to studying the War for Independence. All right, in my introduction. So firstly, right, and not of importance and not necessarily even chronologically, but firstly, you have the ambiguity of English legal rights. The English Constitution is organic. It's meant to slowly evolve like a living organism based upon parliamentary law, the jurists and their interpretations of those law, the judges and their interpretations and their adjudications between different parties and making statements of fact and of law, um, crown edicts, and so forth. That it's all kind of amalgamated together uh, to um, to constitute a growing, moving organism that is known as English common law. Now, with some of the colonies, like Massachusetts Bay Colony with the Puritans, it was made clear, right? It was made clear that they were to enjoy all the rights of English subjects as if they were born in England proper. And I think we've gone over this. The fact that there were cases that were resolved regarding your blood, sanguinis, if your mother, father, or both were born back in England proper, you were entitled to citizenship in one of the British colonies based upon bloodline. And jus soli, that was birthplace alone. And that was just kind of the opposite. That was whereby you could not necessarily be of English heritage, but have been born in the English British realms and be included as a subject, therefore. You had denizenship. Denizenship was a form of temporary and qualified citizenship rights, and it got very confusing. And your time could wax and wane and end, and you no longer be entitled to those rights. So, at any rate, the fact that there was some ambiguity over what our rights exactly were with regards to subjectship, I think that ambiguity is going to lead toward disagreement by and large, especially regarding any increase in powers that the colonial assemblies and other elected bodies or other bodies of colonials, as they increased in power here in North America, it was not a given that those increases in power would be recognized by English Parliament and Crown. All right. So I think that's relevant context almost no matter what your interpretation is. Also, demographic changes. There was a population blow up in the mid 1700s. And so now, right, you have the French and Indian War, and that had begun when the French were moving in aggressively, building forts in present day Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania and along the Great Lakes up and down the Mississippi. They had claimed from Jacques Cartier as early as 1535 that the Mississippi was theirs. In 1713, They ensconced themselves in Louisiana, present day, the state of Louisiana, New Orleans in particular. And so now they're getting more aggressive going out into the Ohio Valley. All right. So the English give them an ultimatum. There is a hostile mix-up whereby a French official, a diplomat, is killed, and war begins between Britain and France and their allies. So at any rate, you could tell from the name French and Indian War that a lot of the Huron and a lot of the other major tribes in the Northeast, Algonquian tribes, speakers, sided with France, promised, protection from encroachment on their lands by American colonists, English colonists, etc. Enough so, right, that the British would make the argument, especially in the Tory party, that the Americans ought to be grateful for this war. George III will later say that you have more freedoms and opportunities there in British North America than any subjects do in any colonies in the world. So basically, you have nothing to complain about, no grievances, no justifiable ones anyway, in the eyes of British conservatives. And that this war against the French is going to benefit you in particular, because it's going to guarantee English domination of what was known as the Western frontier. And that would eventually, the thought was, be open to American settlement. And so, hence, they were fighting this war for the American colonists just as they were fighting for Mother England and her dominion. So, anyway, that's arguable, but that is a perspective amongst the Tories, especially the conservatives of England. And the fact that we did not pull our weight in the French and Indian War, there were requisitions, formal petitions for so many malicious soldiers amongst the colonists to volunteer and fight for Mother England against France and her other enemies, and also tax revenue that was asked of the elected assemblymen amongst the colonists to give to the war cause. Well, according to Paul Johnson, I believe Larry Schweikart and other U.S. historians, they contend that America did not pull its weight. We not only did not bring in, we did not only not volunteer the number of soldiers that were requested of us, we didn't bring in the tax revenue either. And then to add insult to injury, you had many cases of Americans smuggling with the French enemy in the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean. So at any rate, we definitely developed a reputation for um, apathy and defiance and ingratitude during this war. And so when it's over and England has more dominion to try to hold on to, and the American population blows up, and you had both. You had people moving into the western peripheries, and you had people moving into the cities. And they both regions kind of blew up in numbers. And so now the British are thinking of the practical issue of just keeping law and order, keeping the American colonists from starting wars with the native tribes, which were expensive, etc. So hence, right, you get kind of a general political sentiment that the colonies need to be better, more rigidly regulated and looked over at the end of the French and Indian War. And that's going to cause, obviously, some confrontation. So, in addition to that, um, you have ideological movements, right? Movements about beliefs, philosophical beliefs, etc. So the most salient that kind of stands out is the French Enlightenment around the 1740s. All right. And, a lot of them were deists. They contended that the universe abides by natural laws, that the creator is kind of like a watchmaker. And he created everything to run by logically and scientifically discerned natural laws. All right. And that which is natural, they thought, is most healthy and best for humanity. So here's a big fundamental premise that changed. is Rousseau, right? Jean-Jacques Rousseau. John Locke, I believe. I know he had the social contract. I remember reading it, but I don't recall about his general assumption as Rousseau had. But what they surmised, right, was in the natural state, man should live in relative freedom. I say relative because man, because of his flaws as a creature, must have institutions like police force and government. Okay, it's kind of a necessary evil. The need um, for government and other semi-coercive institutions is seen as evidence of our fall, like the fall of Adam and Eve from Judeo-Christian tradition. And so they're like our fig leaves, right? When Adam and Eve sinned, they first realized then that they were naked and bothered by it. And so they had fig leaves sewn to cover themselves as evidence of their loss of innocence. And the same thing here with government. But government is a necessary evil, and it is to become our servant and not our master. All right. It's a big premise difference. So government is obligated to protect in a contractual manner, right? A contract made volitionally by two parties, the governed and the governing, that they are to protect the governed's natural rights. Now, what were some of those natural rights? They were espoused by different individuals of the French Enlightenment that became kind of symbolically connected to certain specific ones. So Voltaire, right? Voltaire was an iconoclast. Iconoclast means that you smash everything that society has traditionally held to be sacred, kind of like South Park. He was iconoclastic. He made fun of priests, kings, etc. So much so that in writing that he had to flee France. But at any rate, Voltaire is seen to be the father of the freedom of conscience, the freedom of expression, freedom of speech, etc., freedom of religion. All right. You have Beccaria. Beccaria wrote about the rights of people when they are suspected of having committed a crime. If you've ever read or seen The Count of Monte Cristo or something of that, of the Ancien regime, of the old school way of doing things, you could not only be innocent, but you could be, standing up for something in the name of integrity, and the crown wants to keep you hidden because of the crown's, uh, misbehavior. And so they throw you in a dungeon and you're not heard of again. And nothing even close to due process is granted you. So Beccaria fought against that. All right. Um, Diderot and Condorcet wrote encyclopedias because they were all for the right of the individual, the natural right, to cultivate oneself, to learn a trade vocationally, to become educated academically, and to go as high as your personal talents and effort can take you, regardless of bloodline. And remember, Europe in the early modern era is still very much traditionally connected and institutionally connected to a landed aristocracy. Remember, aristoi means the best in Greek, a group of people because of their bloodline claiming to be superior to their peers and therefore entitled to sit on the Privy Council of the king or queen, to take seats in the House of Lords, which was not elected, and so forth, and to be granted the first entitlement to the choicest of lands, a monopoly on the big money makers like cocoa, sugar, slavery, etc. Okay, tea. So at any rate, that's part of the Ancien regime of an aristocracy enjoying most of the political, economic, and even cultural domination. Uh, Writers like Diderot and Condorcet were against that, obviously, against any kind of special, artificial, as they called it, privilege because of your mere surname or bloodline. So, at any rate, those are some examples of notions of natural rights. And then, of course, the most famous, arguably, were by Rousseau and John Locke in their social contract oriented books. One was called The Social Contract by Rousseau, the other one was called The Second Treatise on Government by John Locke. And they stated that man has a right to life, liberty, and property naturally. And the idea is, right, is if it's a natural right, you're entitled to it. The government doesn't have a choice as far as extending it to you as if it were a magnanimous gift, but it's an obligation that is owed you by virtue of being made as a human being, period. Okay. So very much more egalitarian, everyone on equal footing rhetoric during the French Enlightenment. And then with the Scottish Enlightenment, it was a lot about it was very much libertarian by and large. Remember, libertarian is like government don't tread on me. You're very much against a highly concentrated, distant, powerful government. Very distrustful of man with too much power, with what they would call arbitrary power to do as you wish. So instead, right, they were for the rule of law. They were for a liberal constitution that protected individual rights, civic rights, rights that were granted by government. But again, the government was obligated now under the Scottish Enlightenment to secure certain natural rights in legal form, in civic fashion. So at any rate, a couple people that I think of, you have Bolingbroke, and you had two journalists named Trenchard and Gordon, and they had a paper called Cato's Letters. And Cato was a symbol of fighting for the Republic of Rome before the Republic fell and it became more tyrannical under a consul now calling himself emperor in the Senate. So at any rate, with this notion in the Scottish Enlightenment is they wanted to make sure that there were checks and balances. Even though the most famous checks and balance book was written in the French Enlightenment, and that was Montesquieu, the Baron de Montesquieu, in his book called Spirit of the Laws. But anyway, they very much adhered to that idea of checks and balances, people accountable to those that they rule. And another assumption that came from the Scottish Enlightenment that was big in the colonies, at least with our rhetoric, what we claimed, right? And that was that it was called Robinocracy. And I don't know the origin of that name, but Robinocracy. And connected to that term, there was a fear, right, that the would-be tyrant is going to try to take liberties, right, given too much power, kind of like Lord of the Rings stuff. That man can't handle too much power. It brings out the base side of him, lust for more and more. And so at any rate, that king or queen is largely going to try to take rights away from people, right, and reverse the course of history toward greater democratic involvement in government, etc., right? To incrementally, by little baby steps, try to take one little liberty and opportunity or power after another in very subtle, incremental fashion. All right. So I think you know where I'm going with this is that the um, the taxes that Parliament passed on the colonies, right? The Sugar Act, the Townshend Act, etc., the stamp tax, um, they were not burdensome, evidently. When you look at the value in shillings or pounds, they were not very expensive. They were not very burdensome to any of the demographics that had to pay them. But what they said, right, was it's the it's a possible precedent, right, being set by would-be tyrants to take us in a backwards uh, trajectory, taking away our rights one by one. So it's the principle that now, for the longest time, our elected assemblymen had given their consent to taxes, and now they lost that. Now Parliament speaks for them. Parliament said that we were virtually represented, and that was good enough. And by virtual representation is the idea largely operates under the assumption that anybody from your same socioeconomic strata, someone who does the same thing as you for a living, right? For instance, if anyone with your same job and socioeconomic strata is in parliament, then that person is virtually representing you. And it doesn't matter that he lives in Liverpool or Bristol or London and you live in Boston. He's speaking for you as a fellow, leather apron artisan, skilled worker, or merchant, or whatever it might be, or commercial farmer. So at any rate, that did not sit well with the American colonies, that we were virtually represented and that we had once enjoyed for quite some time the assembly's power to give permission to tax, and then it was now taken from us. All right. And remember that the English colonies were colonies, right? And England had treated, yes, granted, like with the just solely cases, people born in Scotland after 1707, when they were formed together as Great Britain, had the rights of Englishmen. But if they had lands in England, they couldn't just come and take them. There were still other areas in the law in which the English discriminated against Scots and said, no, sorry, you have the rights of Englishmen, the basic rights, but you can't come and own all this land and claim all this land here in England proper, because you are, at the end of the day, still a Scot. So if they're willing to do that with the Scottish, sharing the island with them, formally uniting with them as Great Britain, how much more was it likely they were going to treat the colonies as different from England itself? And so supposedly people like Benjamin Franklin traveled back to Europe and tried to have a open and amicable debate over different claims, and it's not gonna work with British Parliament, and we're gonna come to a vital disagreement whereby our representatives say whatever powers that our assemblies and our American subjects have acquired, if we can look to a certain case, right, etc., then we've acquired them for good, because that's English common law, right? It's organic. It slowly grows and evolves. And we're, after all, we're English subjects. That was stated in several of our initial joint stock company charters. So at any rate, the British decided, no, no, you are to be treated separately as a colony, a mere colony, and whatever rights that you've acquired in the past, we don't recognize those, or powers. We no longer recognize those. So at any rate, that is clearly in one way or another at the heart of the rebellion. All right. So anyway, these things, I humbly contend, I think no matter what perspective you come from, no matter what your historical interpretation, starting assumptions about mankind, etc., and culture and other things, economics is, I believe that these still are pretty vital to remember, recall, read about when you're making a decision in your personal analysis and evaluation of the War for Independence and what it really was and what it was really motivated by, et cetera, et cetera. And then juicier detail is found amongst more iconoclastic historians like, oh gosh, Howard Zinn, right? And his People's History of the U.S. He comes across on page 10 and he tells you right off the bat that he's Marxist. He believes that capitalism is inherently parasitical and that he wants to uh, convey conflict history and get the reader to empathize with the demographics that were at the bottom of the pyramid, the manual laborers and the poor in particular. All right. So what he contends, right, is there was no such thing as a united set of 13 colonies. That within each colony you had so many factions. A faction is a group that shares the same self-interest and or worldview. Okay. And he says you have all these different factions, and they started really splitting in the mid 1700s on account of the population boom and on account of a commercial boom that really kind of separated the wealthy from the poor. So the gap between the rich and the poor seemed to be growing, according to his book. All right. And in particular, this poor versus rich establishment narrative is fed by instances in his book of people going to the West because everything on the East Coast, the best seats in the House basically were already taken. So then that in that sense, if you were still ambitious, you oftentimes stereotypically headed west. But they'd fight with natives. They demand to be chartered as new cities and new towns over in the west. They wanted to elect someone to their colonial assembly. They wanted to have a say when they were taxed, where that tax revenue went and what causes. And so hence, right, you have cases even of formal petitions by some of these poor and Western frontier oriented demographics, whereby they're complaining about their own assemblymen, saying their assemblymen are out of touch, that they're elitist, that they're kiss ups to the British, and they neglect their own constituents, etc. So you had the regulator movement in the Carolinas. Soon, here in the midst of the war, at the end of the war, you're going to have a Daniel Shays rebellion. And they were very much oriented around those themes of kind of rich versus poor, establishment versus the ambitiously poor white men. So some people think that that is also vital information, okay, going into it. And then you have the basic narrative of taxation and protest, right? So this is a very bare narrative, okay, of mine. It's just the very basics hit in like Gordon S. Wood's basic book on the American War for Independence, etc. Is in 1763, the year the French and Indian War ended. The British Parliament passed a law to cut off the Western frontier from would-be pioneers, right? Poor, white, ambitious men, mainly. And they declared that land to be Native American territory. And they wanted to keep the peace and have profitable trade with these particular tribes. And so they kind of threw the poor, ambitious colonists under the bus with this proclamation of 1763, because to them, right, that was their avenue toward what we would later call the American dream, socioeconomic ascendance, rising up the ladder socially and economically, and politically for that matter. So at any rate, you have that. Then in 1764, you have the Sugar Act, and that's the first act that is blatantly, and it was more than sugar, molasses and other things that were taxed here in America without our assembly's consent. So then in 1765, it hits certain demographics that are well connected, and they're able to protest more effectively, arguably, and that is the stamp tax, because lawyers, entrepreneurs, anybody who had business papers to print out, official business papers, had to pay this special tax. And so they began to organize as well. Then in 1767, you have the formation. Oh, and by the way, with the Stamp Act, you had the Stamp Act crisis. You had the Stamp Act Congress, and you had the Stamp Act riots, all connected to that one, uh, what we thought was an unconstitutional tax. All right. There was a mass rebellion amongst the the commoners in Boston. There, you had the formation of kind of grassroots organizations like the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, different chapters in different towns, and yeah, so forth. And then you had the Stamp Act Congress, whereby the assemblymen are going to begin to collaborate with one another. The assemblymen in Virginia with the assemblymen in Massachusetts, et cetera, et cetera. And a big organization that helped tie them together, supposedly, were the committees of correspondence, really brought into use by 1772. All right. So then you had the Townshend Acts, and that was made by a liberal Whig as prime minister, thinking that, okay, this is an external tax at the ports only, so Americans won't protest this. Well, he was very wrong. Then in 1770, you have the Boston massacre. An American boy gets in a fist fight with a British guy, gets the better of him. They're competing for a rope factory job, supposedly, and he gets chased to the leader of the British fort there in Boston, pleads for protection. An angry crowd surrounds them, begins pelting them with rocks and stones, and shouting and chanting, and they fire into the crowd. The leader contending to his dying day that he did not order them to fire, but they fired nevertheless, and they killed 5 people. And Paul Revere and others made paintings of it. They put it all throughout the press. And that's another thing is by this time, by 1770, the printing press is going to take off and have a life of its own. And the most well-cited pamphlet is arguably Common Sense by Thomas Paine. And the name is pretty appropriate. It's just that it's common sense they should protest these things. It's common sense that a little island should not rule a great North American continent, that they economically need us more than we economically need them, etc. All right. You have the press in Philadelphia under people like Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was known to be an iconoclast, very brave, very adept at satire and sarcasm, etc. You had John Adams and John Dickinson as well, and you had Thomas Jefferson and these other kind of literati who have read the French and Scottish Enlightenments, who have read the protest papers back in England, like Cato's letters, and began printing either directly that material or summarizing it in their own language in shorter form so that the common person could imbibe it, could take it in and believe in it. Okay. So at any rate, that is Bernard Bailyn's thesis, is that we are an exceptional country born on lofty ideals that are steeped in the French and Scottish Enlightenment, the Great Awakening, religiously, etc. And the Great Awakening, by the way, was all about conditional deference. If you didn't believe your leaders were following God's will and living with integrity and ruling with integrity, you had the God-given religious right to defy them. Okay, so that was big as well. It was the Great Awakening. So at any rate, you have all this going on. 1773 or 74, December 16th, they're going to have the Boston Tea Party. They granted only the English East India Company the right to sell tea to us. And when they revoked all of the taxes on the Townshend Act through our boycott, they kept one on tea as a symbol that they were still in control and they could still tax us without our permission. And they gave the Declaratory Act that said that Parliament virtually represents the colonies and is sovereign over them and can decide their fate. So at any rate, you have all that happening. Um, you have cases of customs officials trying to collect taxes, trying to ensure that only those with the proper monopolistic papers are trading in certain commodities and not smuggling. And you had the Gaspé affair in Rhode Island, where they were attacked and perhaps even killed, and their ship was sunk off Rhode Island. And you had the tar and feathering tradition that was found more often in Massachusetts, in the Boston area. They tar and feather these tax collectors. And so now things are getting out of hand. All right. And so at any rate, and remember that the Stamp Act Congress agreed that they would not okay any taxes in the future that had them that declared that they would have to pay a tax without their permission. And then you have the 9216 episode. Massachusetts made the decision even prior to the Boston Tea Party, which they'd be heavily punished for as a colony. Um, they made the decision that they were going to use the committees of correspondence to team up with one another. That if given an ultimatum, they were going to sever themselves as assemblymen and form their own national legislature of rebellion, which would form into the Continental Congress. And so the British put troops in the room with them to intimidate them and gave them a chance to veto that act. And 92 to 16 or something like that, I know it was 92, they voted to maintain it. They said, okay, Assembly, you no longer exist. So now, kind of like with the French Revolution, when they met on the famous tennis court, they're going to meet in taverns and just these very, atypical uh, institutional and natural environments, and they're going to meet in secret. And they're still contending that they're the true voice of the people, the assemblymen, but they've been, knocked out by the royal governor. So the assemblymen are going to split in their allegiance. Some are going to form these, will turn morph into the Continental Congress, and some stay loyal to the British. Same thing with the militias, those who stayed loyal to the British, the Tories, as they began to be called, fought with Mother England against this rebellion in official capacity. And those who broke free called themselves the Minutemen, who would be ready at a minute's notice to stand up for the rights of the American people. And so it ends up so that the American colonists send out the Olive Branch petition asking King George III to intervene and tell Parliament to step down and capitulate to our demands. And he did not react favorably to that. And then news came that Sam Adams and John Hancock and others were meeting and militarily training to rebel and collecting weapons in Concord, Massachusetts. So Commander Thomas Gage is sent from Boston to Concord to arrest them and confiscate their weapons. On their way there, they're stopped at um, oh gosh, Lexington, and by Minutemen who refuse to step aside, and they fire on the Minutemen and kill like 13 of them. They go into Concord, they kill two more. Um, on their way back to Boston, they were sniped by American Minutemen, and now it was on. At that point, the gloves were off, and the Continental Congress asked a young Thomas Jefferson to write a Declaration of Independence for the reasons for which we were declaring our independence from Mother England. And we raised an army, put George Washington in charge of it, and the rest is history, right? So at any rate, in fighting that and looking at this, the salutary neglect thesis shows how politically the assemblies garnered more and more rights, powers, and privileges during a time in which we contend that the British um, governance over us became lax. All right, and we took advantage of that laxity, not only politically, but economically. We didn't carry the right papers. We smuggled. We did what we wanted for a living, regardless of what the English mercantilism system said.